I don't know if any of you are first-generation college students, but I was, and I grew up in the Boston area in a blue-collar Irish Catholic neighborhood. My dad was a meat cutter. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college, and I had to get scholarships and work. And I grew up summers swimming in Boston Harbor next to a coal port and a Procter & Gamble plant and a shipyard. And I can remember sometimes I'd come out of the water and you'd just be covered with oil and all sorts of awful stuff. This is a long time ago. They've since spent millions and cleaned up Boston Harbor. And then when I went to college, I commuted my first year to save money, and we used to drive through a black neighborhood called Roxbury. And I don't know if you know anything about Boston, but it is an extremely segregated and racist city. And Roxbury we used to drive by a animal rendering plant which produced awful effluent and smelled horrible. And I used to think, how can people live next to this plant? And I thought about it for this panel, the difference between what I experienced as somebody from a low socioeconomic neighborhood and somebody from a low socioeconomic neighborhood who was also not white. And I didn't like swimming in that goop in the summer, but these people had to live next to this plant every single day. And so in my discipline, geography is all about location. So I want to talk about environmental justice, but also tell you that it really is also very strongly environmental racism. And in fact, years ago, when I first heard about this topic when I was at the University of Washington, the term wasn't environmental justice, it was environmental racism. And if you go back and look at articles published back starting in the 70s when this was first explored, you have to look under the term racism because it very much correlates with not being white as well as being poor, or as Professor Hayes talked about, indigenous people's rights, people who are marginalized or less in power. So I wanted to make this a little bit about what's going on right now. And knowing this panel was coming up, it caught my attention on September 20th on National Public Radio when there was a story about Hurricane Florence approaching the Carolinas, and the fact that it was very much apparent that if you were a poor person living there, you were going to get hit. And you were going to suffer from it a lot more than somebody who had some means to get away from the hurricane or protect their property. What the story on public radio said that didn't occur to me till I heard it was how little access to flood insurance you would have if you were poor as well. Or you could get flood insurance, but it wouldn't be very good. And if you're interested in this topic, you could find it on the archives of public radio. It was September 20th. Since then, there's been some pretty good stories. So I just pulled a few off the web, for example, from The Guardian. And I guess it's an introduction for these next few slides I have. The main message I want to tell you is that I am not giving you a theory or a political opinion. I'm giving you empirical, verifiable, factual information that if you map bad things in the environment, it almost always correlates with people who do not have the resources to counter what's going on. So location can kill you, and that's not an exaggeration. I'm going to show you a map of Seattle, which will surprise you. And since geographers emphasize location, we're social scientists who look at location, this is very much part of what I used to teach about here at SPU. So Seattle Times had an interesting article recently about this, and Jean Bach, who's a very good researcher and does a lot of articles with data for the Times and maps, we like maps, says, for example, in King County, you can predict how long people will live by knowing where they live in King County and looking at the census information. So then the question is that just a coincidence? Is there a correlation between it? Is there cause and effect? There's definitely a correlation and probably cause and effect for a lot of things besides what to do with the environment, but the environment is part of it. So let me just show you quickly a few empirical facts that you can research, or if you'd like to get in touch with me about the sources of information. Most of these are from the EPA reports. So African Americans are 79% more likely than whites. This is what I noticed when I drove through Roxbury on the way to Boston University. Commissions on racial justice have done work on this too. Where do we put hazardous facilities, toxic facilities? It's not in Laurelhurst, I can tell you that. Poverty-stricken indigenous communities, in our case Native Americans, Dr. Hayes talked about Central Americans, have some of the worst toxic pollution in the country. If you look at the Navajo Reservation, for example, in the Southwest. Children of color are much more likely to live in neighborhoods where they're dealing with lead poisoning. If you remember the case with Flint, Michigan, everybody was affected who had those old pipes, but it was especially kids in poor neighborhoods that were dealing with that. And lead levels, of course, are terrible for children as far as their development. So I wanted to show you some of the information from our very own backyard, because even though we live in an affluent part of the country, not everybody in the greater Puget Sound area is affluent, and so your zip code can very much predict the amount of toxins that you're going to be exposed to. And some of the worst of it was down in the Duwamish Valley and down towards Tacoma. Native American communities who live along the Duwamish River and used to live there have been very active in battling this, and there has been some good news cleanup along the Duwamish, which is really positive. But very much there is a correlation with per capita income zip codes in the Seattle area and the whole Puget Sound area. So I pulled off a few days ago the EPA map. This was the most recent one I could get of where some of the worst toxic waste cleanup sites still are in this area. And you'll notice, first of all, if you're a good geographer, you'll see they correlate with water sites, because a lot of it's dumped into rivers and streams and places along the Sound. But you'll also see how much they go down to the former industrial area and the poorer parts of the city.